911 dispatchers at Reddit. What is a seemingly dumb call you got which turned out to be serious? Not a dispatcher. Was USAF security forces a long time ago. Call was a kid home alone. About a monster in the closet. Which was a bit weird. Because the kid seemed a bit old for that. Holy duck. There's a snake in the closet that's gotta be at least 150 pounds. Promptly close closet door. Nope, right the duck on out of that. Kid in hand. Called animal control. Called parent. Parent arrives first. Indicates they don't even own a snake. Let alone a people-sized snake. All parties agree monster in closet was accurate enough description of event. TLDR. Monster in closet turned out to be real. Not dispatcher but paramedic. Got called to a woman who told emergency she had hurt her knee. Literally what it said on our dispatch screen. This woman had been a serial caller for all sorts of trivial, non-emergency complaints in the past. The local ambulance area manager had been to talk to her about appropriate use of ambulance resources. But nonetheless we didn't think much of it. Arrived and her right leg was nearly twice the size of her left leg. Her kneecap wasn't even visible, although some light palpation seemed to indicate it was about 15 centimeters further around her leg than it should have been. Turns out the previous afternoon she had hurt it when she had fallen about 2 meters off a ladder whilst fixing a gutter. Didn't think to tell dispatch this, but wasn't sure if it was bad enough to call the ambulance or go to hospital. She also though maybe she lost consciousness for a few minutes but wasn't sure. Her leg was so unbelievably swollen and unbendable there was no way she was going to be able to get it into a car, let alone how she would have driven herself with a dislocated knee as she lived alone and had limited support. So we reassured her it was a good use of our resources and encouraged her in the future to call the medical advice line after future injuries if she wasn't sure whether to call the ambulance. A guy called saying people were living in his stairs. I totally thought he was insane. People were living in his stairs. Got a call from Life Alert one time, saying that one of their clients was stuck in her kitchen because her wheelchair got stuck on a cupboard. She wasn't in duress, just needed to get unstuck. Wasn't an urgent call and it was a busy night, so the road SGT had to pull the unit off the call twice due to more urgent calls. After he pulled the second unit he said he would go and help her while the other calls were being handled. When she arrived the caller's front door was open with just the screen door in place. It was a nice day for a breeze. She could see the caller from the screen door and tried to ask if there was a way to unlock the screen or if she would have to cut it to get in. The caller was not responsive to our SGT, so she called on the radio that we should have FDN route and that she was going to have to cut the screen door to make entry. And our SGT made it in. She found that the caller was sitting in her chair at the sink and was washing dishes. The caller appeared to have dropped a knife and cut into her ankle. She was unable to bend down to stop the bleeding and was on blood thinners. She did not make it. Noise complaint. Neighbor playing music too loud and no complainant. Only reason an officer responded was because he was bored. Turns out it was a 14-year-old girl whose parents were out of town. She invited the 25-year-old man from a town 3 hours away to come over and have a six with her all night long. Cop showed up and found him, some beer and a bunch of condoms laying around. He went to jail. She went to the children's home till her parents could get back. This is more on the EMT side, and not really dumb, but all the time people call 911 and tell them someone, their parent, spouse, child etc. is unresponsive and breathing. It sucks when you get there and they are actually just having agonal respirations. Aka things just got way more serious. Agonal respirations are not sufficient breathing and are merely a reflex the body has when there's insufficient oxygen. A lot of times the family member didn't realize this was not adequate breathing and didn't start CPR, allowing for brain damage via oxygen deprivation. Sad. Got a call where the caller was on the highway and just screaming. Couldn't figure out what was wrong because he was so amped up. Ended up being someone got hit by a semi-truck or something and the body parts were all over the highway. Yikes. A call came in and this hard to understand man says my friend is sick, he's choking from too much penis. Turns out he said peanuts, his friend had a peanut allergy. Not an officer. I was hanging out with a few of my mates. We were playing truth or dare. One of my friends were dared to stand in cement until it had hardened. By the time we realized how dumb of an idea this was, he had become part of the ground. Luckily, Dispatch came over the instant we called them, but we got a lecture about not wasting their time. We did the same thing 2 days later. Dude sent a picture of a body saying he had killed someone. Really bad quality picture. I thought it was lob. Sent a unit just in case. Turned out legit murder. Not the hardest case to crack. Probably doesn't fit dumb, but this guy called and told us he killed his entire family. None of us believed this could possibly true. Turns out he wasn't kidding. He sounded totally cool and collected when he called us too. Still haunts me. Former dispatcher. Took a normal call. Guy reported his call stolen. Woke up from a nap. Car was gone. Not much to go on. Take the report. Move along to the next call. Fast forward a few years later. I'm not working as a dispatcher anymore. But the police arrive and hand me a subpoena. Weird, not weird as a dispatcher. Happens all the time. So, I go to court. Meet the Crown and they had me a transcript of the case and ask me if I remember it. I read the first couple of lines of the transcript. Totally remember the call and the conversation, despite being several years prior, and proceed to give them the general idea of the entire call, from only having read a couple of lines. Crown. Perfect, thanks. Defense. Crown. We won't need you any longer. I still never found out why the whole thing had actually made it to court in the first place. But based on the lawyers that were present, I could safely say it wasn't just a stolen car. Really late to the party, but it's worth telling. My center took a call from a number like 5 times in an hour. Always radio silence on the other end. On the 6th call we finally heard enough of a voice to know someone was there and got an address and enough to know it was serious. Make entry to the house and find the caller. A man had picked up his soon-to-be ex-girlfriend to talk. He then duct taped her mouth and zip tied her wrists and ankles and spent the next 14 hours beating her with a bat, raping her, used a blowtorch to give her second-degree burns all over her legs and genitals, and broke her cheekbone. It was an absolutely terrifying moment, and what made it worse was on review of the tape we could hear her say help on one of the previous calls, but couldn't hear it on the initial call-in. Not dispatcher, but dumb call. I work at an urgent care. And a lady called and casually said her son was struck by lightning. He seemed fine, but his primary doc wanted her to take him in for an EKG in to check out his cardiac enzymes. Told her to go to the emergency room, and she said, "Well, can't you do an EKG? Your son was struck by lightning. He needs to be monitored, as these symptoms can show up later. His heart rhythm is probably ducked." Let's talk about the 911 of that ended up in Josh Powell blowing up his house with him and his 2 kids in it. That operator did not take it seriously at all, emo. Not mine, but my cousin. Got a call from a young woman, went like this. Cousin. 911, what's your emerg? Person. Mumbling, whispering. Cousin. What, I can't understand you, mom? Person. Mumbling, whispering. Cousin. What's the address? Person. Road. Cousin. Okay mom, what's the problem? Person. Still whispering, there's a giant man in my house. Cousin. Okay ma. Person. Screams bloody murder. So a story behind this is that the young girl was home alone and the girl's parents were at work. A man saw the house, and since there was no cars there, he thought no one was home and broke in through the window. And as he was breaking in, she hid under her bed and called the cops. But the thing was, she went under her bed where she wasn't facing the door, which means she couldn't see him walking, and her foot was sticking out, and he grabbed her legs and pulled her out and stabbed her, but she survived thankfully. So yeah. Not me, but I had a friend whose dad was a cop tell me that they had someone lying naked in the road at a NASCAR race. When they got there they found that the guy had multiple bombs strapped to his chest and they had to work to defuse the situation. Had a hang up 911 call just before shift change. Flow procedure and call back. Get mom on the phone who said small child was playing with phone. We sent someone from roll call out. When I got back 8 hours later it was brought back up to me because the 7-year-old playing with the phone was actually calling 911 because mom bit a large hole in her cheek. So we got a call from a couple a few years back that said they had dated edibles and thought they were gonna die and all that. Obviously we thought they were just anxious from the marijuana. It turned out when we got to their apartment that the marijuana they had gotten was laced and we had to rush them to the emergency room because when we got there they were passed out. So that's my story, Reddit. My uncle was a cop and I was with him by his car and got this call. A person said her daughter was going to be arrested and wanted to know what she did wrong. They were puzzled and thought it was a prank call. A lady called saying her daughter called her because she was pulled over at the garbage dump and police were searching her because they spotted a couple of empty beer boxes in the back of the truck she was driving. The officer wasn't listening to her when she said she was taking them to the dump. The police said it is probably a story because none of their officers were on that road. My uncle was out on patrol and saw another officer. He radioed and asked if there was anyone at the dump. He said he didn't know of any of the officers being there. My uncle responded to the scene and found a girl pulled over. My uncle stopped the scene to find out it was a fake cop. Obligatory, not my story. But my friend is here with me and he is a dispatcher. He says one day a man called and said he got rear-ended. So my friend said, "Okay, how many vehicles were involved?" And the guy said, "None. I was rear-ended." Turns out the man was trying to report a rape. So that was dark. The opposite. I had a woman screaming and crying that her boyfriend had been shot. The whole police department and fire EMS respond to shooting calls. She was extremely rude and didn't finish EMD protocol with me. Didn't answer on callback. Turns out she verified the wrong address. And her boyfriend was hot, not shot. She had misunderstood him. Sometimes people call on 911 for non-threatening things and vice versa. So it doesn't surprise me when the first line is, "I don't know if this is an emergency or not." So while at work one of those comes in. "I don't know if this is an emergency, but I just saw a man shoot out the back window of a car while it was taking off." Yeah, that would qualify. Mom. Then about 4 minutes later, I get the 911 call from the girlfriend of the victim. She was driving her boyfriend to the hospital. The swan escaped from the castle. Not me, but my cousin is a paramedic in a small town in Texas. They had received many calls from a family with a diabetic teen daughter over the years. Usually every instance was not an emergency. These calls from the parents started coming in more often and typically the symptoms were mild to moderate. Certainly not life-threatening. They always advised the parents how to manage her condition so these calls wouldn't have to happen. Late one night the parents called complaining that their daughter appeared sick. My cousin and the paramedics thought it was a typical non-emergency case and didn't rush to the scene. The station was 20 minutes away. My cousin couldn't have known the seriousness at the time. The parents just said their daughter was sick looking. When they arrived she was dead from diabetic shock. My cousin thinks she died minutes before they arrived and years later still regrets not rushing to the scene. My D is stuck in the wall. I was the caller. 3 weeks from Christmas. Pearson Airport in Toronto have deer living in the woods on the edge of the property near HWY 401. Arguably the busiest highway in North America. Well, the fence was down and there was a deer on the edge of the 401, so I called to report a doe on the road. The operator said, "A doe?" I said, "Lord forgive me, but I couldn't help myself." "Yes, a doe. A deer. A female deer." She laughed. I laughed. A truck swerved so as not to hit the deer and took out 2 lanes of traffic. We stopped laughing. Got a call for debris in the road on the main highway heading into town. It was outside our town limits, but was passed on to us as it was pretty close, and the sheriff's department was going to take a while to get to it. We often took small calls like this as a courtesy to their depth. Once the officer arrived, he discovered the debris was what was left of a motorcyclist in a HT and run. The body was in pretty bad shape, most likely hit by a semi, and had been subsequently run over by other motorists not realizing what it was. It gets pretty dark out in the desert, and the body looked more like someone had dropped some old clothes off the back of their truck or something. We had to track down the lady who made the original call. As it turned out, she was in the local convenience store. We discovered one of his arms had flipped up and become lodged in the grill of her car as she ran over it. Along with dealing with the original call, we had to call an ambulance as the lady panicked and went into shock when she saw the arm. Ended up being a long night. After the initial investigation phase, the whole thing was turned over to the sheriff's department. I never did hear if they caught the guy who hit him. Got a call of a 1-vehicle accident. Standard. Turns out it was my 15-year-old cousin who burned to death, and there was another vehicle involved with a mom, dad and 2 daughters under the age of 10 in the vehicle. Family in the other vehicle were okay. Dad had a broken leg and mom had a cracked hip, if I remember right. Little girls were unharmed. The guy that forgot his serious tag on his post. Not a 911 dispatcher, but earlier this month, our city's emergency line had posted on social media, "Please stop dialing 911 to let us know there was an earthquake." Not my story, but I took a wilderness first aid course with a former EMT who shared this story with us. An elderly woman calls 911 to report that her husband has a splitting headache. She didn't sound too stressed or afraid, so the ambulance took its time getting there to check up on him. Didn't turn the sirens on or anything. My instructor, knocks on the door and the woman answers. He asks where her husband is and she leads him to the kitchen, where her husband doubled over onto the kitchen table with a chef's knife lodged in the base of his skull. Shocked, he asked the woman how this happened. She replied, "I did it. Now can you get him out of here? I don't like the smell." I don't know what happened after that, but he did show us pictures of the crime scene.